Okay, good. Okay. Good morning and welcome to Congregation Rodeph Sholom's Coffee and Conversation. This one in particular to commemorate Yom Hashoah. I am Carol Weinshell, Vice President of Program and Membership, and it is my honor to host this morning's program and share the Zoom call with our friends from the Church of the Apostles. You all know that I am very process-oriented, and this morning's program will be no different. I have tried to mute all of you, but will ask that you do so if not already done. This will eliminate any distractions like phones ringing, doorbells ringing, etc. Additionally, this program is being recorded, and when ready to share, there will be a constant contact message with the information. There are many people on this call who have family stories to share as they relate to Lily's promise, and I will try my hardest to give everyone an opportunity to speak if they so desire. I ask you to keep your remarks brief out of respect for the number of people who have joined us this morning. A personal comment as to why we have read this book. It was a gift to me by my oldest son's wife as part of her Christmas Eve tradition, a book and chocolate. She selected this book thinking it appropriate for me to read. She could not have been more correct, and I owe Anne a heartfelt thanks. One comment on the book I would like to share is that Lily talked about silence and why she didn't share what happened to her. You all read the book, so you know that it was a long time before she shared. I believe there is a lesson to be learned about not keeping silent. Each one of us has a personal reason as to why we keep silent. But for me, I learned so much from Lily that I will think twice if there is a choice of speaking out or remaining complacent. I will now open this up to anyone who wants to speak, beginning with my best friend and critic, Bobby Markowitz. And we will go from there, leaving time at the end to hear from our own Rabbi Richard Eisenberg. So with that said, I'm ready to begin. And Bobby, it's all you. Will you unmute and I will make the screen bigger so you can show your picture.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So there's a lot here. I gathered up, some stuff. And I guess I'm going to try to make it brief. The other night, I had my mother's yahrzeit. Both my parents were Holocaust survivors. My mother was liberated from Auschwitz and my father from Dachau. They met in liberation camp in Germany. My mother was Hungarian, my father was Romanian. They met there and they spent 3 years in Bad Reichenhall, Germany afterwards. I skip out a whole bunch of other stuff and a lot of it was in Lily's book. Part of the silence was something that they were either trying to forget or something they weren't trying to scare us with as children. I grew up in Montreal, Canada. That's eventually where my parents ended up. My father was survived with 4 brothers. One stayed in Europe. 3 brothers? 3 brothers. One stayed in Europe and 2 came with him to Canada, where his sponsor, an uncle, had come to Canada in 1920, became very wealthy in real estate and retail stores, and sponsored every Holocaust survivor he could sponsor to Canada. He gave everybody a job in his store, and he made a wedding for everyone in his beautiful home every Saturday night with music. The brides had dresses. And this went on as long as he knew there was somebody out there he could help. He lived to be 101. His name was Joe Schrader. My parents were the beneficiary of his goodness. My mother and father married. They were one of the couples who married in their basement. And before they were married, my father said to my mother, I would like to marry you, but only if my brothers can come too and live with us. Imagine your future husband tells you, I'd like to marry you, but my brothers are coming to live with you as well. There's a picture right here. I don't know if you can see it, Kara, of
Yes,
their wedding
I
day.
can.
There's my mother, my father, and his two brothers. And they all lived together in a little room till each one of the brothers eventually went out and got married, met somebody and got married. They each brought their $5 a week to the new family. And my mother stayed home, cooked, cleaned, and took care of the brothers and her husband. I was a big deal. I was born the first child after the Holocaust to a family that had been completely wiped out, and they didn't know, what kind of child would come out of this. Would it be normal? Would it be healthy? What would it be? And I was, I guess, a very big deal. One quick funny story, just to lighten the load a little bit. I was a baby in the crib. My mother was getting dinner ready. She gave me a nice bath so I could be fresh when her brother-in-laws came home for dinner, and the husband. And while she put me all fresh into the crib, I guess I pooped in the diaper and did a nice finger painting job all over the crib. So when the boys came home, my mother went in to get me and almost had a nervous breakdown. And one of my beautiful uncles, who is no longer here, I guess, cleaned me up. So that's just a little light story for a very dark subject. I was a journalist in a previous life. In 1999, I started a journal to try to get their histories. They didn't want to talk about it for a long, long time. And they wanted me at some point to write their story, but they were reluctant to talk about it. And since I lived in Connecticut and they were in Canada, I would go up there and take, an hour interview with each one of them. It took 5 years to compile their stories. It came in as 2 separate stories, is when I tried to do it as one. They had conflicting, descriptions of what happened. So I took 2 stories and finished the book in 2000. It's really a memoir. I finished it 5 years later. When I brought it up, finished and compiled, I sat down with my father and I said, Daddy, look, I finished your story. And he said, when did you do this? And I said, every time I come up here, I ask you about some of the stories and you tell me. He said, can you read it to me? He had just begun to enter a dementia stage. And I start to read the story. My name is Yehuda Moshe Prezent, and he starts, I was born in Sighet, Romania in 1920. So he could recount everything he told me, but didn't remember in the last 5 years that I took his message. So he didn't have the short memory, but he did have the long. They never wanted to talk about it as kids. We would get snippets of stories. It was always a secret. Eat your soup, because I had to eat grass. You have a coat, it's cold. I was in Canada. We didn't have coats. My father left his family of 7 brothers and a sister, and the father was a tailor, made each one a coat from a blanket before they left. It was a blanket coat. They were used to hardship. And when he was on the forced march, he had a little blanket coat in the freezing cold. A young, rich kid got into the line with a nice big sheepskin coat, he told me. He said, and in 15 minutes, one of the Germans
took
the coat from him, because they were also cold, marching these people. And the young fellow perished because he wasn't used to the cold. In the end, my father was, he said, something like 69 pounds when he was liberated at Auschwitz, but he made it through with his blanket coat because he was used to hardship and he didn't need a sheepskin coat. So that's a commentary also, I guess you could say, when you're somehow hardened, how do these people survive? Was it luck? Was it God? Was it they were used to hardship? It's a question you'd have to ask yourself. They say they were lucky. The number on my mother's arm for the longest time, we would say as kids, what is that? The grandkids would say, what kind of number is that on your arm? What kind of tattoo is that? And she would say, it's my phone number, so I don't forget my phone number. Because she didn't want the younger ones, us, anyone, the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, to know what this really was. So that was the secret. Although they wanted me to tell their story, they also were very disturbed in repeating it. My mother would tell me that my father had nightmares after my little interview. Maybe we shouldn't do this. They didn't speak to the Shoah Foundation, although my aunt in New York, who entered Auschwitz with my mother at 14, did go to the Shoah Foundation and did have an interview, which I'm grateful for today. So it was my mother and her sister who walked in front of Mengele as 13 and 14-year-olds and survived Auschwitz. My mother had a lovely voice, and I guess she says she sang for him. My aunt, who was told by her mother to protect her little sister, lost a finger in the munitions factory. But when she accidentally cut it, she held her silence to be not recognized as someone who might make trouble. And so she didn't say anything. You know, it's a long story. There's a lot to tell. And I know there's some other people who'd like to talk, but I came across something this morning that I think you will find interesting, Carol. I've got a library full of books. This was a liberation, a commemoration, an anniversary, a book in 1995 in Canada. And I came across this one picture here. I don't know if you can see.
Yeah.
It's good. What it says underneath is, as I saw these men, brothers, flesh of my flesh and blood of my blood, I could not help but think of the old cliche, there for the grace of God, there but for the grace of God go I. And the author of that little quote here is Rabbi Herschel Schachter, U.S. Army chaplain, liberator of Buchenwald. And this is the same Rabbi Schachter that shows up in Lily's book.
Oh my goodness, you're giving me the chills.
Yeah, so I found it this morning. I'm like, I better get ready for this or Carol's going to kill me. So here it is. And anyway, I'll get off now and let somebody else talk. There's a lot to talk about.
Thank you so much, Bob.
You're so
Appreciate
welcome.
it.
You're welcome.
Okay. Who would like to go next? Where's Leslie? Leslie, I know I have some pictures. Hopefully I'm going to be able to show them. So give me a minute. I have 2 pictures, Leslie, that I can make happen. Can you see the pictures? Okay. Leslie,
Hold on, let me,
okay.
yeah, I can see the picture. The person in the middle whose face you can see, that's my stepmother-in-law, and these are her sisters. And I can't read the Hebrew, so I can't tell you what it says, but the kids in Israel of the kids whose parents are in here, they posted it on one of the days for the Holocaust. And those 5 sisters have the same story like Lily's promise. They were from Hungary. They got captured. They all went to Auschwitz. Then what happened is when they got liberated by the army, United States Army. Instead of going to Switzerland, they went to Sweden. And then from Sweden, they went to Israel. And my father-in-law was divorced from my real mother-in-law. And he met her, I guess, at an absorption center. And then they got married and they lived in Israel. And all these sisters stayed in Israel. There's 3 sisters that stayed in Israel. And then my mother, and then she has siblings that were either, her brother was in a camp where he sewed or did something, and there was another brother. There were 8 kids all together. They all survived. Like I say, 3 of them stayed in Israel. The rest got to America. They lived in New York in the Bronx and Bayside, Queens. And I don't know, their story was like Lily's story and whatever.
Thank
So
you.
that's all I've got to tell about that.
Thank
And
you.
also too, I just want to say that they never talked about what happened to them in the concentration camps. And it wasn't until one year we were there for Passover, and on TV, they had this thing about the Holocaust, and it was about this woman who was saved in the Holocaust at the camp by playing the piano. And for some reason, during the Passover Seder, they started talking a little bit about the Holocaust. And otherwise, like, they never said anything, as far as I know. And that's all I've got to say, so people can talk.
Thank you, Leslie. That was the better of the 2 pictures. The other one didn't come through clear enough. Before we go into more stories, I'd like to know if anybody would like to comment on the book. On Lily's story. Anybody with any thoughts about the book? Bobby?
I think she does a very good, semi-abbreviated version of what happened to her. It doesn't, for those of us who've read The Choice, Edith Agar's book, that's also a very beautiful book. The writers of this book, and I'm not quite sure, who in the end, because there were a lot of people to thank in the book. As I read through it as a former journalist, the writing was really fantastic. It was very easy to read. It was, there were some shortened versions. It wasn't a really, it certainly described the life, that they endured, but it wasn't in any, it sort of, I didn't feel it was in grotesque detail of things. And I thought in that manner, it was easier to read. It wasn't as hard to read. And I've read a lot about this. So I thought the writing was great. I thought the story of the family was true and wonderful about how they were separated, how they never, saw a couple of the family members, how, and how the life was, how happy the life was. The life was like a happy life, the way Anne Frank's life was happy. And then all of a sudden it wasn't happy anymore. So that's the scary part, that we're living in a time where, it's a little bit weird out there, for lack of a better way to say it. And so it's normal, but it's not normal. And her descriptions were great. And I was deeply, profoundly moved by the grandson taking over,
The
great-grandson taking over an interest in this and trying to move it forward. And it's lucky for all of them that she's still with us. I checked on that also afterwards.
Yes.
I wasn't sure, to see the fruits of her generational labor, to see that this will continue in her family. And, I just thought it was an excellent book. And I was glad to be told about it.
Anybody else on the book? Tamara.
Yeah, I love hearing that, Bob, how you describe that. That's how I was feeling too, but it helps me to hear that from your perspective as someone whose story is so closely, there's so many parallels to your story with what was here. So one thing I was wondering is how it felt to you to read the book. Did it feel reassuring, validating? Did it open up wound or feel more like healing? Or
With each book that I read, I learn something new because there's so much to learn. There's so many, even while they were all in the same place, was their experience different? You know, where did they all come? They all pretty much came from the same little towns and little life and little daily routines. But then what happened to them there could have been different one from the other. So I learned in each one of these things, some of them more, you know, horrific, some of the books I've read, some of them more enlightening, some of the ones, you know, that lost entire families, some that survived through some miracle, ended up in Cuba and Shanghai, all over the place. And so it's a huge, obviously, period in history where people were all over the place. So for me, some of it reiterates what I know, some of it is new information. Most of it is, when I think of my parents, how did they come out of this and start a new life, and how are they smiling in some of these pictures? This one picture of them, here's my mother and father meeting in, you know, dating as a couple.
amazing.
Back then, how are they smiling?
Mhm.
Everybody, the human spirit, and I guess the rabbi can comment on this, the human spirit wants to keep living and laughing. I mean, how do you laugh after this? And I guess that would be my question for the rabbi. How does a person move forward with sameach, you know, with joy? Where do you get the courage to start a new family? And maybe that's why they were so strict with us. I had a curfew of 9 o'clock as a teenager. That's when my friends were first going out to party. I had to be home at 9 o'clock because maybe she was worried that we weren't going to come back. Maybe they had that, you know, fear with them through the whole life. Maybe that's why they held on to us so tightly, so strictly, which they were. So I don't know. I just hate to monopolize this conversation, but I'm just.
Well, no, thank you. That is, thank you for letting me ask that too, Carol. I was
Oh,
curious
no
about that.
problem. The Zoom is open to any question.
Yeah.
I-
Well, I
yeah,
was just going to add too how much I appreciated Lily's, the way she stitched together pieces. So not only, I felt like the insight obviously into her experience in Auschwitz was profound, but then watching her experience in Israel at every stage along the way, I felt like it was piecing history together for me in a way that I could enter it with more empathy. Like the the way their security is threatened just continues to be threatened as they go into Israel too. And just the thought of moving from place to place to place. I knew that intellectually was true. I knew that was part of the history, but I felt like her story helped me enter that in my heart more, to understand. I felt really tired. I felt a sense of fatigue that must have been. And yet, as you're saying, like the joy that she shares is compelling. I left the book feeling that sense of joy, which is mind blowing to me. That's where I would end up.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Charlie, Rabbi, I know you have something you want to say. Is it okay if I let Charlie go? Okay, Charlie, go ahead.
I was very moved by how this lady, when she was young, kept her family together.
Her sisters.
And then when they went into Auschwitz, she was able to save them. She took when what's his name? The guy was going back and forth here. She was able to bring her sister, one of her sisters, back
When she pulled
into
her
her.
sister back when
Yeah.
she was chosen.
And that was amazing.
When
Yeah.
she was chosen.
And that was amazing. I can't believe that. And throughout the whole book, she was always able to keep the family together. She got married and she made a wonderful person, wonderful man. And they were able to help others. And at the end, it was amazing how she had such a big family. Her whole living sisters married, had children, and now she has like a tribe. She got cousins, niece, and nephews, and great grandchildren, and it was very interesting. Unfortunately,
I don't want to put you on the spot any more than I have to, but can you tell us briefly about I remember you're telling me
yeah.
about,
Well,
you know what I'm asking?
it's my family. My father was taken from when we were in France. The Germans came in, and French and German police told all the Jews to go to City Hall, and my mother said, "No, don't go." He said, "No, I'm going," and they all were taken into the trucks when they got there, and put into the trucks. They went into a work camp in the south of Paris, and from there he was there for a few weeks. At the end of, and then my mother's was sending things to him, and
Be letters.
they wrote letters to each other, and then he sent a last letter that said, "Oh, they told us we're going on a trip on a train," and the train, of course, went to Auschwitz, and that's where he died. My mother had three other sisters. Two of them died in Auschwitz. Her older sister survived, and my mother survived. And it's now I have a very small family. So
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you for letting me put you on the
I think
spot.
Carol's
Thank
screen
you
is
for
frozen.
My screen is frozen? Am I frozen?
No.
No. Okay. Anybody else with a comment?
I think Toby has her hand up, and Walter.
Oh,
I think
okay. I'm
Walter
sorry.
had his hand up
Thank
also.
you. That's why you're my partner, right? Rabbi Eisenberg, to be my eyes. Toby, you're muted, Toby. Oh, Toby.
Okay,
Thank you.
after listening to Bobby's comments, I ran downstairs to get a photo to show you because this shows how the people under duress were still trying to find some normalcy in their lives. This is a picture of my mother and father-in-law. I'm sorry for the glare.
Yeah.
They are sunbathing on the rooftop in the Warsaw Ghetto. You can see destruction behind them and around them. And they are just a young couple in love, newly married, and he's smoking a cigarette, sitting there sunbathing. And they just looked for normalcy where they could find it.
That's
I love this.
incredible.
Isn't this beautiful?
It is. I'm so glad that Bobby's comments triggered your getting the picture to share with us.
Yeah. So, but I didn't even want to talk about them because past years, Yom Hashoah, Bob and I have talked about his parents quite a lot. But this week I was telling Carol about a woman in our family This is who wrote a book. And she reminds me so much of Lily because of how she has dedicated her life to education. And this is a book. It's called They Are Still With Me. Her name is Hafka Folman Rabban. She died in 2014. I just pulled up yesterday an article about her in the Jerusalem Post right after her death. She grew up in the Warsaw ghetto, well, before it was the ghetto, and she lived with her family across the street from a youth center that when the Germans came in and were making hardships for everybody, this youth center took over the job of educating the kids and the teenagers in Warsaw. And some of the resistance groups came out of this youth center. And she could not wait to be a part of it. She was a very young teenager, but she started working with them. Her two older brothers were with them, and she idolized them. She became a courier for these organizations. She would be sneaking in and out of the city, carrying papers, carrying munitions, information to different parts of Poland. She had false papers. She didn't look particularly Jewish. Anyway, she was ultimately caught, but because of her false papers, when she was sent to Auschwitz, she was treated as a political prisoner, not as a Jew. So her life was not as hard as it could have been. Fast forward to coming to Israel, she and several of her friends in this youth group formed a kibbutz called Lohamei HaGheta'ot. It's the ghetto fighters kibbutz. And it's in the north part of Israel, very close to the Lebanon border. And they built a museum dedicated to perpetuating the stories. And she's even mentioned as a courier in Yad Vashem. She gives speeches on Yom Hashoah. There's a huge amphitheater where heads of state come to gather. She gives speeches. She gives tours of the museum. She runs some of the programs bringing teenagers to Poland and then to Israel. And she goes with them to the concentration camps, tells her stories, then brings them back with her to the kibbutz, to her museum. So she's just been so remarkable. And she died in her 90s back in 2014, but she was really remarkable. And we've all in our family felt very privileged to get to know her, stay in her home. And
Toby, can you repeat her name and the book again, please?
Hafka Folman Rabban. Carol was looking it up this week and she could not find it here. We were given a couple of these books when we were in Israel. We were given them by the family.
And what was the name of the book again?
They Are Still With Me.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I tore the library apart and I couldn't find it, but I will look again for sure.
I seem to think back maybe 5-10 years ago when I was trying to get more books that I had to send to Israel for them.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Walter.
I just really appreciate you all inviting us, because this was, I've read about the Holocaust, but there was something about, that's like history and facts, but when you read somebody's personal account, it just makes it more personal. I mean, it's a person now, and I appreciate you were inviting us to read with you, and because it really, it just touches you in a different way, and I think it's very important. It's devastating what we've done and the silence and I think and I'm talking now about the silence of others in terms of not helping, in terms of ignoring what was going on. I mean, it was just so that one line when she said, Israel was the only place that anybody wanted us. It's just so anyway, so I think this is important. I think it's important for me, and I think it helps us almost, yeah, put names and faces to people so that we can now carry that a little bit better and truly pass it on to my children and my grandchildren. That this is, we need to pay attention to each other.
That's a great segue. Rabbi, I didn't forget about you, Honest. It's a great segue for me to ask my friend from Winter Park, Florida, Judith Hara, to share a story with you. And I want to tell you that she is one person who did not take silence literally. And I was privileged when I was visiting her to hear her for the first time speak to a group of students about her parents' story and the promise that she made to keep their memory and keep them alive. And she's wonderful. I watched middle school kids and their parents, which I thought was wonderful because then the parents heard it. They were mesmerized, truly. I sat there with her husband watching her, and she's going to tell you a story. She's somebody who does not believe in coincidences. Thank you, Bob. So Judith, the story you have to share is really something.
Okay, I'm a 2G. My parents were survivors. And on my father's deathbed, his last request to me was to tell his story. But I'm only going to tell one very brief one. In 1973, my husband, Bob, this is Bob, I'm Judith, went to Israel, and we were staying on Kibbutz Lavi. And while we were there, we befriended an elderly gentleman from Belfast, Ireland. And we were in our 20s, he was in his 80s. And usually you wouldn't befriend somebody with that large age difference. But somehow it was like a magnet. We had dinner with him every night for 2 weeks. He would wait for us from when we were sightseeing, and he was a very special man. And during those 2 weeks, my husband, Bob, took a picture of me and this gentleman. And when we got back to the US, we were showing the pictures of our trip to Israel. And we showed my father this picture.
Wait, I'm going to make it bigger. So, okay.
Okay. So we showed my father all the pictures of Israel, my parents actually. And when I got to that photo, my father said, "Who is that man?" And I said, "Oh, Dad, he's just a really nice man from Belfast, Ireland, who wanted to make Aliyah and move to Kibbutz Lavi. But because of his age and his health, the kibbutz turned him down and he went back to Belfast." And my father said, "What was his name?" And I said, "His name is Harry Cohen." And my dad turned white. And my father said, "Harry Cohen from Belfast?" And I said, "Yes, just a sweet guy, Dad." And he said, "I've been looking for this man since the war. He's the man that saved our family." And I immediately wrote Harry Cohen in Belfast, and it took 2 weeks to get a letter there and 2 weeks to get a letter back. So a month later, I get a letter from Harry Cohen in Belfast, and enclosed in the envelope was a photograph of Harry Cohen and my family, and a letter saying he met the daughter of Ernest Rapp, and he just felt that his life had been complete. And he was so happy to hear that I had been born, and my sisters, that my dad and his family survived. And my dad wrote him, and I wrote him again, and every letter after that came returned to sender. So in my heart, I believe that God kept Harry Cohen alive for him to find out that the family made it. And then his life was complete. And that's when I learned at the age of 23 that there are no coincidences.
So you see why she speaks to children. Thank you. I know I put you on the spot, but
No,
I
that's fine.
had to do it. I just had to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more comments on the book before I turn it over to Rabbi Eisenberg? Lana?
A small comment. Actually, there was a very nice foreword written by Prince Charles. It was a very extensive comment, and I welcome people to read it. I was very impressed from a standpoint. I guess he made a lot of donations and to the cause, and he's a very actually very surprised in a nice way, if there's such a thing. I thought that the young man was extremely bright and should go far in his life. From personal experience, some of the comments that people made about both my parents and my husband's parents are Holocaust survivors. We left communist Russia when I was 52 years ago, actually. And I always attributed, my husband left a few years before that, and I always attributed that to the fact that parents were not afraid to say, hell with all of this, and let's leave everything behind. Let's come the way we are, basically the way we were born, and just go to safety and make sure that the kids have some future instead of living always in fear. They never, I agree that they have never really liked to speak about their experiences. And it was always, you had to clean your plate because you don't know what's going to happen. There was a lot of, anti-Semitism and things of that nature, and discrimination and all of that. And, but that's not what I want to say. I do, the few things that I did manage to get out of, whether my husband's parents that were much older or my parents that were teenagers when they were, under the Nazis, and the fact that they didn't want to talk about it, but the only few things that I managed to get out of them is because, I tried to get some reparations for them from the Germans. And they required documentation and things of that nature, which was kind of sad that you need to prove what you are and whatever you are or what you endured. But at least in a small way, it's really nothing, but it's acknowledgement before anybody publicly acknowledged that there were problems from all the sides. And there were issues both all around the world that people kind of closed their eyes on what was going on. And the things that were happening, and the boats that were turned back, and one can talk and talk about it, but it should never happen to anybody else. It doesn't have to be Jews. It could be somebody else. We can't be standing by quietly and watch people suffer and being persecuted, because one day it could be us. So,
Thank you.
that's
I want to say this because I know that there are messages in the chat and I cannot see them for whatever reason. So if somebody has something that they want to say, would you please raise your hand? That's why I'm not calling you, because I'm not seeing it. I don't know why, but I'm not seeing
Carol,
it.
I don't see messages in the chat.
Okay,
Carol,
good.
Gracie has her
Yeah,
hand up.
I see that, Gracie. Thank you, Debbie. Thanks, Bobby. Okay, Gracie.
Yeah, I just have a little comment about the coincidence that Judith talked about. Charlie's mother and father, when he was in the work camp, communicated with letters, and apparently they took pictures. So he sent her a picture of a group of the gentlemen that were there. This, of course, was before they went to Auschwitz. Years and years later, France opened up a Holocaust museum, and Charlie's sister Suzanne and her husband Howard went there, and they were collecting stuff. They brought the letters that their father wrote, and to be displayed. And she met the curator. It was a woman, and she was showing her some pictures of the father, who was also in Auschwitz. And when Suzanne saw the one picture, she says, "Oh my God, I have that picture at home." And she says, she showed her, this is my father, and they were standing next to each other. And she said, the curator said, "The only thing I don't know is when this happened." So Charlie's mom always dated everything. Suzanne said, "When I get home, I will send you the date." It was 1942. Luckily, the curator's father survived, but as everybody has said, he never spoke too much about what happened in the camps. So again, coincidence, maybe, maybe not. It was meant to be.
Thank you, Gracie. Rabbi Eisenberg.
Thanks. I really, I have too much to say, but I'm just going to say a few things. I'm really just going to try to condense what I have to say. Okay. First, and I think perhaps most important, is to welcome our friends from Church of the Apostles. Carol, I'm sure you already did it earlier. I had to come on a little late, but to welcome Pastor Brian and Jane and our other friends. So important that you're with us, and thank you. As far as the book itself, I would say that it's really quite a remarkable book. As I mentioned during services this past Shabbat, Lily's promise. When you see a book about the Shoah and you see the word promise, it's often one would kind of assume, or I assumed anyways, that the promise had to do with her promise to survive, or her promise to take care of her sisters, whatever. I didn't guess that she was really talking about her promise to tell the story. And after several decades of silence, almost silence, she was able to find her voice. And it's also remarkable that she was able to do so with the help of a 16-year-old great-grandson. And I think Dove, in the book, I think when the book was published, he must have been maybe 18 or something. I mean, he's a kid, So it's very heartening to see that the story continues on throughout the generations. Also, what I thought was remarkable about the book was not only the way she told her story of suffering in the camps, but also the way she told her story about what happened after in the second half of the book. It's really very enlightening, to read about the DP camps, to read about Israel in the year or two before Israel became a state, and then Israel's early days as a state. It was really, I thought she did an excellent job. And then her move to England and issues that she confronted in England. And also I thought, one of the things that I found wonderful about the book was her religiosity and her orthodoxy did not in any way lead her into a place of judgment or judging others who are less religious or who have less faith or who have less observance. I mean, she's very comfortable in her own skin about being an Orthodox Jewish woman, but she did not in any way put down anyone else who was less religious. That leads me into a quick comment on what Bobby said earlier. And I think, if you want to really read the best, to me, one of the best explanations for how could people smile, how could people survive, how could people live on and carry on their lives, if you haven't read it yet, read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. I'm guessing, I don't know if Pastor Brian read it or not, but did you? Yeah, it's really worth. Viktor Frankl. Frankl was a psychotherapist, psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz, Birkenau, And that book gives one of the best explanations about the human personality and its propensity and ability to not only to survive, but to find meaning in the suffering, you know? So no one could explain it better than Viktor Frankl from a psychological, psychiatric point of view, and also from a spiritual point of view, you know, that just the light of the human spirit that is able to survive and find meaning after such a horror and catastrophe. Having said that, I'm going to sound for a moment like a downer, and I'm just going to, because I feel like I just have to say this, which is that when we read stories like this, like Lily's story, we are reading the stories from people who did find meaning, who did find the ability to tell the story, who did find the ability to survive. It's generally, the accounts that we do not read are from the ones who did not. I'm not talking about the ones who were killed. I'm talking about the ones who survived, but were so traumatized and suffered from such deep post-traumatic stress disorder that not only were they unable to talk about it, but they were unable to really live in a way that found happiness and joy. There were many who lived the rest of their lives in darkness and under the cloud of depression. And I just have to mention that because they too were the martyrs. They too are survivors in their own way, in a different way. Their story may not inspire us the way Lily's story inspires us, but their story reminds us of the horrible degradation that can be inflicted by evil people against innocent people, you know, and that reminder is important as well. So I pray for them. I pray for all those, you know, who suffered, for those who were able to find meaning and happiness, as well as those who unfortunately had to cope with depression and darkness the rest of their lives. I knew one of them, I'm not going to mention the name, but I knew one of them actually, who lived where my mother lives in Sinai Residences in Boca Raton. I knew a survivor who actually was based on her life, her story was part of Schindler's List. She was the character Helen Hirsch in Schindler's List. If you remember, who was kind of a housekeeper for the evil Amnon Goth in the movie. She for her whole life, unfortunately, fought terrible depression and was never able to really be happy. You know, so it takes all kinds, and it's a matter of personality, and no one can judge and no one can understand it fully. That's the last thing I want to say is that I just want to point out the difference between Yom HaShoah and the International Day of Holocaust Remembrance. Carol, did you cover that at the beginning?
No, I didn't. I was
Okay.
leaving it for you.
Would it be all right if I took a moment to just address that?
Yes, because I will go over by a few minutes. I have something else to share.
Okay, so
No,
I'm going to be
go
quick.
for it.
No, this will be quick.
That's okay.
Yom HaShoah is not just Yom HaShoah, it's Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, or Yom HaZikaron l'Shoah v'Gvura, meaning the day of remembrance for the Holocaust and for the acts of heroism, because it was established in the state of Israel in the early days of the state. It actually was approved as a national day of mourning by the Knesset in 1959, but in the early 50s, it became something that was observed on the 27th of Nisan, which is the Hebrew calendar date marking the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And the Israelis in the Yishuv, you know, in the early days of the state, many Israelis did not want to focus on the slaughter of the 6 million, right? They were very uncomfortable with the idea of Jews being led to the slaughter like sheep to the slaughter, and they wanted to mark also the resistance, the fighting. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising to them was a symbol of Jewish bravery and resistance. And so they wanted to bring that aspect into it, as well as the extermination of the 6 million, as a way of kind of marking not only the martyrdom, but also the heroism and the bravery and the resistance. So I just wanted to make that point, number one. Number two, the International Day, because a lot of people get confused about this. So Yom HaShoah goes according to the Hebrew calendar. It's on the 27th of Nisan, which means that because we follow a lunar calendar, in any given year, it's going to be a different day, right? Because we follow the lunar calendar, it's going to be a different day on the solar calendar. But the International Day of Holocaust Remembrance is always on January 27th. Curiously, it's also the 27th, that number. And that day marks the day that the Red Army liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau. So they chose that day to be a day of Holocaust remembrance. The Jewish world, starting with Israel, marked it on the 27th of Nisan, but also wanted to add the element of Jewish resistance as well. Carol, as our friend Erwin likes to say, that's all I got.
Okay, thank you. Always thank you. Before I conclude, and I know some people had to get off, Bobby had to leave, she had a business meeting. I want to tell you a non-coincidence coincidence. When you all know I supported soldiers, and in 1993, when I was at Helen Keller Middle School, we were a World War II commemorative community. I was lucky enough to be invited to the commemoration of World War II by the woman. She was a major who was in charge of this program, and I went to Washington. You can only imagine how delighted I was pre my support. And I'm standing out as close as from the front door of the synagogue to where the gift shop is, to the dais where the president is. It was President Clinton at the time. And this young man was standing next to me. And he said, "So who are you? Why are you here?" And I told him what I did, and not to be undone, I said, "And why are you here?" And he said, "Oh, I'm the president's speechwriter." I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. How much of a coincidence is that? How lucky am I to be standing with a president's speechwriter? And then he proceeds to point, and he said, "You see the man on the dais behind the president?" I said, "Yes." He was an old man. He said, "That's my father." Okay. And my father is being recognized today. And then the story of his father came out on the dais. His father was a little boy in Auschwitz. And the US Army tanks rolled in. And they had it was an American flag on the front of the tank. And this was a little boy, and he didn't know what was going on. And one of the soldiers scooped him up, put him on the tank. And the soldier had recently died, but there was a picture that sort of went viral of this soldier with the little boy. And so I was like, holy smokes, how is this possible that me, Carol Weinschel, is here for this, to see this man? Years later, I could not, and I still cannot, I always have to go back and look, I couldn't remember the man's name. So I did some searching that took me to a YouTube video of a flyover of helicopters that were flying over where I was standing. And the next thing I know, I hear the name Captain Mike Musial is leading the helicopter formation. Well, you probably know where I'm going, but I supported Captain Mike Musial's unit when he was in charge of one of the units in the 82nd Airborne. Now, all of this began to unravel. I came home. I had been at services. I came home. I'm writing to this man in the middle of the night. Mike, please be patient with me, but I have a story for you. And I go through this whole thing, and he writes back, who would have thought 20 years ago that you and I were connected and would be connected to this day? And so, Judith, I should have thought to tell you that when we visited. It's quite an incredible world we live in. As far as I'm concerned, we couldn't have had, personally, a better way to commemorate Yom Hashoah, to hear the stories firsthand from our own congregants, to share this with our adopted family from Church of the Apostles, as Debbie Walls, our president, calls them, our church, because we have developed such a relationship that we share so much together. It couldn't be a better way. And I feel like we're listening to Lily. We're not staying silent, we're sharing. And if each one of us, like when Judith spoke and the kids heard it, the parents heard it also. And the more we can share and the more we can talk about it, it has to do something good. It can't stop with us. So from my perspective, I can't thank you enough for joining us. I know some people had to leave, and I promised that, we'd be through at 11, and I knew in advance. So that's no problem. Nobody left out of disinterest. That I can tell you for sure. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming and for making this program so worthwhile and so very special.
Thank you, Carol, for organizing. Thank you.
Thank you.
You, Carol.
Thank you all. Such a joy.
Thank you.
Thanks
This
you.
was
Thank you,
great.
everyone, for sharing.
Thank you, Carol.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Did an
Bye.
excellent job.
Have a good day.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna leave.
Bye-bye.
Much as I was moved by what Leslie said and what Bobby said, Walter, he may still be on, what Walter said is what really